Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Judy Berger. I'm the president of Sisterhood, and we are so happy to see all of you joining us tonight for this program. And I am one of very few words, and I'm going to turn the program over to Terry Jonas, who is our programming vice president and the organizer and everything else. So here's Terry.
Thank you, Judy. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Like Judy said, this is absolutely wonderful to have so many of you with us this evening for this really fascinating program that Helene is going to be presenting. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Helene has just retired as the president of a 400-member lifelong learning sled club in Florida that evolved from Brandeis Women. She's a lecturer for NOVA's Lifelong Learning Institute, FIU's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and FAU Osher Lifelong Learning on a variety of historical and cultural topics. She's such a slacker, I can't believe it. Helene has had over 30 years of executive level experience in global marketing for a variety of American manufacturers in diverse product areas. She holds a BA in anthropology from NYU. Her background in cultural anthropology was instrumental in putting her on the path to her marketing career. In January, Helene has assumed the position of Executive Vice President of Sisterhood at Temple Beth Torah Sher Tzedek. Now, as the program is going on, I'm going to ask that everybody please stay muted. And if you have a question, please put it in the chat. I will be monitoring it as we go along. We will do questions and answers at the end of the program. I turn it over now to Helene.
Okay, welcome everybody, and happy year of the white ox. China and Jews. I always thought it was about the food, or maybe about mahjong, or maybe the fact that we both had a lunar calendar. It wasn't until I was at a fundraiser down here in 1999 honoring the righteous among the nations that I learned about the Shanghai Ghetto. And it was there that I actually got to meet the grandson of one of the story's heroes, Dr. Ho. Later, I changed jobs and I started traveling to Shanghai on business. And that's where I began my journey of discovery, studying what is commonly called the Shanghai Ghetto. From 1933 to 1941, Shanghai became a modern-day Noah's Ark. And during World War II, Shanghai, while synagogues and Torahs and Talmuds and yeshivas were being destroyed in Europe, Shanghai became one of the world's great Jewish cities. The numbers vary depending upon the source that you go to. But we think about 27,000 refugees fleeing the Holocaust went through Shanghai. Many of them were able to go on to other places, and most of them stayed in Shanghai. About 20,000 is the number most people come up with. In the designated area for stateless refugees, commonly called the Shanghai Ghetto, these Jewish refugees lived harmoniously with the Chinese and to a large degree, but not always, with Japanese. By the time the war ended in 1945, almost all of the refugees had survived. Now, I have been doing programs on this since 2008, and I've interviewed many survivors. And tonight, we are very honored to have Senor Pedro Liebendag here from Buenos Aires, who lived in the Shanghai Ghetto 1941 till 1948. At the end of the program, we're going to see a brief video excerpt of a video that his daughter did, and then he will be speaking and talking about his experiences in Shanghai. Okay, almost forgot to turn on my program. Here we go. So we're going to learn some history tonight. We're going to learn history, and history is about war and about trade. And this is no different. This is about the foreign control of imperialist Shanghai. 2 small wars. If you vaguely remember world history, it may ring a bell, but probably not. 1845, you had the first Opium War where the British defeated the Chinese. And then in 1860, you had the end of the Second Opium War and the Treaty of Nanjing that opened up Shanghai to foreign trade. And you kind of had a foreign city within this Chinese city. The international settlement, which was the British and the Americans, and later on the Japanese, who mostly settled in an area called Hanqiu, and then the French settlement, which I was back in a few years ago, and is very French with wide boulevards and a tree line. But these were not under Chinese jurisdiction. These cities, the city within a city, were not under Chinese jurisdiction. That area of Hanqiu was about 1 square mile, and that is where the designated area for stateless refugees, commonly called the Shanghai Ghetto, was later established. So there are 3 waves of immigration to Shanghai. Between 1845 and the first Opium War and 1941, actually it was September 1941 when the city was officially closed to refugees by the Japanese, over 40,000 Jews came to China for business or for a safe haven. A lot of them just came for a purpose and then they left. But the third part of the story, the focus of tonight's presentation, are those that stayed. So the 3 waves were the Baghdadi Jews, the Russian Jews, and those fleeing the Holocaust. The Sephardic Baghdadis had British passports. They were subjects of the crown, came to Shanghai via India, where they had established lots of businesses, including cotton business. They could travel very freely under the protection of the British crown. These were professionals. These were not the 1%. These were probably the 0.1 of 1%. These were extremely wealthy. They were stockbrokers. They were involved in real estate, retail, import and export, and the opium trade. The community grew but remained very small and very powerful and very wealthy. By 1895, you had a whopping 175 Baghdadi Sephardic Jews, and at its height, never more than 800. The Baghdadi Jews primarily were controlled by 3 powerful families: the Sassoons, the Harduns, and the Kadoris. The guy in the turban that you see, that was David Sassoon, and he was very, very into tzedakah, and he passed it on to his children, as did the Harduns and the Kadoris. All these people, very wealthy, active Sephardic Jews, and very much into giving back and taking care of those in need. The second group were the Russian Jews, and then finally the German, Austrian, Polish, and Lithuanian Jews. This is the Bund. The top is an etching from about 1900, and the bottom is a photograph that I took in, I think it was 2011. The difference is the red flags, but look at those buildings. It doesn't look like China. It looks like it could be Munich. It could be Vienna. It could be Warsaw. It could be Paris. It has a very European flavor, but of course the difference is the red flags on the tops of the building. So this very wealthy and influential community contributed to the development of modern Shanghai, which is even felt today. This was the first impression. This European look was the first impression that Jews coming to Shanghai had. And boy, were they surprised. So any program I do is going to have history in it. And this is no different. Whoops, I'm trying to close something there. Okay. Jacob Schiff. Those of you from New York City, it may ring a bell because you had Schiff housing, a low-income housing. So Jacob Schiff was a very, very wealthy German Jewish American banker in New York City. And he was dealing with the influx of immigrants fleeing the pogroms, hearing these terrible stories of the pogroms that were happening in the Pale of Settlement. He was mad. He was angry. Meanwhile, the Russians are trying to expand eastward, trying to expand into and take over parts of Manchuria and northern China. And the Japanese, they also got into the imperialist game, and they're moving west, also looking to take over Manchuria and northern China. So they went to war. What else did they do, right? They went to war. 1904, 1905. Again, a footnote in world history. This man was angry. So what did he do? He financed the war on the side of the Japanese. This was in direct response to the anti-Semitism of Tsarist Russia and the tales of horror. Jacob Schiff helped influence the Japanese attitude towards Jews, whom they saw as powerful and rich, people who could help them. And later we will see how this perception was to the advantage of the Jewish refugee community. So the next group were the Russians. A few came to Shanghai and to Harbin in northern China and to Manchuria, fleeing the pogroms, but most fleeing the pogroms ended up in New York City and in America. But you did have a few coming. And in the first decade of the 20th century, starting in 1904, you started having some Russian Jews coming. But most of those ended up fleeing conscription into the army. We've all heard those stories of our ancestors being conscripted into the army, but it wasn't just the Tsarist army. It was the Tsarist army and the Red Army, fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution, first to Harbin, then to Shanghai, with a way stop along the way of Manchuria. After World War II, through the 1920s, you had a very large influx of Ashkenazi Russian Jews and non-Jewish, called white Russians as well. By the way, the Russian Revolution did not end in 1918 or 1920. It actually lasted in Siberia until 1923, and you had many Jews fleeing through Siberia at the end of the Russian Revolution. You also had a second smaller group in 1931 after the Japanese took over Manchuria. So you had this group of Russian Ashkenazi Jews coming from Siberia, Manchuria, northern China, and they're very different from the Sephardic Jews. The Sephardic Jews were very British. They were gentlemen who spoke the king's English and supported the crown. The Ashkenazis, they spoke Russian and Yiddish. They suffered a lot, and they had no loyalty to the Tsar or to Lenin. By the 1920s, the Russians and the Japanese, because remember I said the Japanese started coming in also, the Russians and the Japanese became the largest non-Chinese population in Shanghai. So the Ashkenazi Russian Jews, whether they brought it along with them or just developed it, had a very strong capitalistic tradition. Also brought with them a hatred of the Tsar, and those coming later, a hatred of communism. So in Shanghai, they created retail businesses, they had boarding houses, bars, and bordellos catering to non-Chinese, including the Japanese. The Sephardic was still the controlling influence, again, wealthy Brits, and they didn't mix much with the Russians. But then I lived in New York City, and I didn't get to hang out with the Jewish elite in New York City, although I did have breakfast once with Michael Bloomberg, but that's another story. So the Russian Jews had Russian and Yiddish newspapers. They had their own stores, very much into the hospitality industry. As I said, bars, bordellos, boarding houses. They loved music and theater. First, when they first came, they went to the cheaper area that was Hankou, and later many of them moved to the French Quarter, where they founded the Jewish music club, where some wealthy Chinese ended up sending their children to learn violin and piano, starting the Chinese tradition of learning to play music, particularly classical music. Now, there was some conflicts between the Sephardics and the Ashkenazi, but basically, like all expatriate groups, they kept to their classes defined by ethnic and economic lines. Came into Shanghai and made a life for themselves, where the rules were few and opportunities were endless. There's a little footnote on the screen there. You see the word radio station? That became very important because, believe it or not, the Russian radio station stayed open until after World War II. The only anti-Semitism that these Russian Jews really faced in Shanghai were perpetrated by the non-Jewish Russian refugees who came there, who brought along the czarist anti-Semitic feelings and communist anti-Semitism. Different synagogues, but increasingly united, particularly as Russian prosperity and population grew. The Baghdadi Sephardim, as I said, followed the examples set by David Sassoon and by the Kadoris, and they worked with the Russian Ashkenazi community to help by establishing the Shanghai Jewish School, establishing a cemetery. And the children started to play together. Although the Sephardic population was very small, they ended up playing together. Yes, they were separated by language, but you find that separation when kids are playing together tends to fall by the wayside, and they learn each other's languages. They were involved in the Shanghai Jewish Boy Scout troops and the Shanghai Girl Guide troop. It wasn't Girl Scouts, it was Girl Guides. And my friend Bill Shertman, he talked about his days as a Boy Scout in Shanghai and how much he loved it. Sports were very, very important throughout the history of Jewish Shanghai. And there was a founding of the Jewish Recreation Club. And the B'nai B'rith Shanghai Lodge was inaugurated in 1928, Lodge number 1102, working hard to bring together the two groups. After all, they were all Jews. And the third wave, fleeing the Holocaust before it was the Holocaust, fleeing Europe. The numbers that stayed in Shanghai vary, between 20,000 to up to 24,000. There were two reasons for it. One, exit visas were for heads of household, and sometimes it might say 2.5 people, and sometimes the children were not even put in there. And also, we'll hear about the Japanese part of saving people, and in the Chinese writings and studies of Shanghai in the 30s and 40s, they tend to leave out the Japanese story. So very few people had the foresight to leave Germany early. The largest wave of refugees were 1937 to 39, some in 1940, and then a few in 1941. The Japanese finally closed the city prior to Pearl Harbor. So you had thousands of refugees arriving with no documents or means of support. Now, some were fortunate, were able to pass through, able to get entry visas into the Americas, to what was then Palestine or Australia. My Israeli son-in-law, Ori, his Berlin banker uncle, went through Shanghai on his way to a banking career in London. but it was very difficult to get the entry visa into other countries. So many stayed, in fact, most stayed in Shanghai. Now, the Japanese tried very unsuccessfully to restrict immigration in August of 1939, did not work at all, and the refugees came in droves as the war not only consumed Europe, but other avenues of escape closed. Why Shanghai? The Paris of the Far East, the New York of the Orient, it was called. Today they would say the New York of Asia. As the rest of the world closed their doors, Shanghai remained a free transit port, quite cosmopolitan with a low cost of living, and it was all about trade, and you did not need a visa to get in. Now, you needed visas to get out, but you didn't, once you got out, you did not need a visa to get in. You needed to get exit visas to book your tickets and depart from Nazi-held Europe. 1935, another war, Sino-Japanese War. Sino means Chinese. And 1935 to 1939, when Japan finally controlled Shanghai, no one really took charge of passport control. And you could get lost in Shanghai. You could get off a ship, you can get off a train, and you can make your way in Shanghai. So when I say the Japanese controlled Shanghai, they did not control the international area or the French concession. The Japanese, because they were late to the game, they lived mostly in Hangzhou, which was heavily damaged. But meanwhile, we look at this picture. It looks pretty, this is taken in the 30s. It's pretty European looking. And it was a place where a foreigner could walk off a ship with no documentation and somehow make a life for themselves. Now, how did they get there? Well, we forget sometimes that until 1941, October to be exact, the German policy, the Nazi policy, officially encouraged Jewish immigration. They wanted the Jews out. This was before the final solution. And many Jewish people, heads of household primarily, were thrown into camps like Dachau, but they could get out if their family could produce exit visas and proof of passage. After the annexation of Austria, March 1938, the Anschluss, and particularly after Kristallnacht, the Jews were scrambling to get out. Now, the exit visas and transportation were expensive propositions, so these early refugees, on the whole, had the money to afford it. After booking passage, they had heavy exit taxes. Could take only 10 marks. That's about $4. But they could take some personal effects. And many women, don't have to give you the details, but you can imagine, were able to smuggle out their jewels. They left one of two ways, either on sea voyages lasting 23 to 72 days, a far cry from my Bubby and Zadie coming here in steerage, coming in first or second class, or through Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Harbin in northern China, and in some cases, actually through Japan. So here's the story of the Schindler of China, Dr. Ho Binshan. The big difference is he saved Jews because he felt it was the right thing to do. He was appalled. He had many Jewish friends, and he did it because it was the right thing to do. I was fortunate enough to meet his grandson down in Miami in 1999. And that's when I first started getting interested in the story of Jews in Shanghai and the story of Dr. Ho. So you had these thousands of Jews going into the camps, and they could get out, but they needed to get an exit visa and tickets. The majority of the world's nations, they refused to budge. all reaffirmed these terrible immigration policies, reaffirmed at the Evian Conference. Unlike most, but not all, of his fellow diplomats, Ho issued exit visas to go to this open city of Shanghai to anyone who requested them. Didn't make a difference where their final destination was. He had many Jewish friends and refused to follow the instructions of his superior, the Chinese ambassador in Berlin, Chang Ji. Little known fact. Prior to the creation of the Axis with Germany, Japan, and Italy in September of 1940, the Nazis were actually working on a Chinese alliance with Chiang Kai-shek. In fact, Chiang Kai-shek sent his son to be trained at a German military school, and he led a panzer division in the Anschluss into Austria. This was the son of Chiang Kai-shek. So hoping to cement closer ties between China and Germany, Ho's superior told him, you can't issue these visas on this large scale. And basically, Ho did not follow orders. Many that he helped reach Shanghai by boat or through the Soviet Union. Many used visas to reach other places, Palestine, the Philippines, Cuba, and elsewhere. And I use Palestine because Israel, 1948, does have a beautiful part of this story. Although most American Jews have never heard of Dr. Ho, he is honored in Yad Vashem, and he is honored in Hangzhou in China. In 1949, he followed Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan, left China, and he had a long diplomatic career as the ambassador from Taiwan to Egypt, Mexico, Bolivia, and Colombia. He retired in 1973 to San Francisco to be with his children. Before he left, he had some issues with the government of Taiwan, and they denied him a pension on questionable grounds. No one knew of his story until his death at the age of 96 in 1997. Interestingly, no one from the Taiwanese government came to the funeral or honored him, but the communist government in Beijing sent a wreath. His story was revealed by accident. His daughter, Manli, was a journalist, and she wrote an obituary, including a tale of him confronting the Gestapo at gunpoint to save his Jewish friends. A curator of an exhibition on diplomatic rescuers just happened to read the obituary, contacted Manli, who worked with him and others, to uncover the story, primarily corroborated through survivors in Israel and through Yad Vashem. In 2001, Dr. Ho, the Chinese Consul General in Vienna, was awarded Righteous Among the Nations for his humanitarian courage in issuing exit visas to Jews in Vienna in spite of orders from his superiors. He's honored in China, he's honored in Israel, but most Americans have never heard his story. So the following short video appeared on Chinese news TV. This is an English version, and they have Chinese TV, CCTV goes throughout the world. This video tells the story of Dr. Ho, the survival of the Jewish refugees, the friendship between the Chinese and the Jews, and it is told throughout China. And this adorable woman watering her plants, I think, steals the show.
87-year-old Lily Feliz lived in Kfar Shaba, Israel. She was in primary school before World War II broke out in 1939.
My father was also in a travel agency, and one day he said, "I have a passage for 2.5 persons. Are you ready?" And so we came. My father agreed, of course, very quickly, and so we came with this ship, what you've seen, through Italy, through the Africa, until Hong Kong, and then Shanghai.
Shanghai was an important safe haven for Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. By 1941, nearly 20,000 European Jews had found shelter there. Iraqi-born Jewish scholar Ezra Yehezkel specializes in this time period.
The Chinese accepted so nicely the refugees, only one country, only one city. So it's important, isn't it? The new generation in China will know something about this wonderful story.
Yad Vashem is Israel's official memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. It was established in 1953. The center also honors non-Jews who risked their lives, liberty, or positions to save Jews. More than 24,000 individuals have been recognized as righteous among the nations. One is Hou Fengshan, a Chinese diplomat in Vienna.
Having a paper saying that you can go to China, in many cases, meant the difference between life and death. And we will always remember Hou for his bravery, for his generosity, and for his nobility. And this is something which will connect China and the Jewish people.
How many Jews were saved through Hou's actions is unknown. But given that Hou issued nearly 2,000 visas in the first half year at his post, the number may be in the thousands.
I still, in compared to what people and Jews had to go through the Holocaust in Europe, we were very, very lucky that we saved our lives. That's my feeling. But I think one should know everything. One should know. Why not?
Today, Yad Vashem is the second most visited Israeli tourist site, with about 1 million visitors a year. It represents not only memory, but also the commitment. Never again. Bang Dongxuan, CCTV.
Lily is so adorable. I've seen it so many times, but I just get a kick out of her. So this is about Chiyun Sugihara, who saved Polish and Lithuanian Jews. And recently, the story of the Shanghai Ghetto was told on a PBS special produced by a Chinese woman. And it completely left out this part of the story, which is understandable to a degree. The Chinese were so mistreated by the Japanese conquerors, and the Japanese relationship with Jews was somewhat misrepresented in this Chinese story, but not entirely. Okay, so remember how the Jew Jacob Schiff helped the Japanese in 1905? Sugihara is one of several other Japanese who actually helped the Jews of Shanghai, and he's the only one to be honored as righteous among the nations. So remember what I said before, okay, about the Chinese getting together with the Germans, and the other little pact that was going on was the Soviet Nazi non-aggression pact. That was before Hitler decided to march into Russia, but they were on good terms. And one of the things that Stalin and Hitler did is they divided up Poland initially. They divided up Poland, and the Soviets got the north, and they also were guaranteed Lithuania. So here's Chiyun Sugihara, and he's a Japanese diplomat, and he's a vice consul for the Empire of Japan and Lithuania, but he was a spy as well. He was a spy to report on Soviet and German troop movements, Japan's eyes and ears in Eastern Europe, because they were suspicious that Hitler was not being completely honest. Again, this is 1939 to 1940, prior to the creation of the Axis. Sugihara helped around 6,000 Jews leave Lithuania, and Polish Jews going, seeking refuge in Lithuania, coming out of Poland. And he did this by issuing transit visas to go to Japan and Japanese-held territories. The Orthodox rabbinical community from Poland gathered in Lithuania. They saw the writing on the wall. Plus, they were also facing a lot of anti-Semitism even before the Nazis took over. Polish has a long history of anti-Semitism. So visas were issued through Japan, including 1,500 from the Orthodox community that settled in Curacao. They had to go through Japan or Japanese territories initially, and many actually ended up in Kobe. One of the things that make the story of Chun Sugihara important is not only he didn't just save lives, he also saved heritage. He saved Torah. He saved Talmud. He saved study. Among the 2,000 Polish and Baltic Jews escaping to Shanghai, all 400 teachers and students of the Mir Yeshiva who continued their studies in Shanghai and the Beth Aharon Synagogue. And Jewish geography strikes again. I did this program for somebody, and it turns out that her daughter-in-law's grandfather was a student at Beth Aharon in Shanghai. So in 6 weeks, a 6-week period, this is when this all happened. In the summer of 1940, Sugihara began to grant visas after consulting with his family. Again, doing it because he said, if we don't get these people out, they are doomed. He ignored stringent Japanese requirements, and he just issued 10-day visas to transit through Japan in violation of orders. Not all of the visas were used because it was expensive to get out. Now, the Soviet officials, they didn't have a problem. They agreed to let the Jews travel through the country on the Trans-Siberian Railway at 5 times the standard ticket price. Sugihara continued to handwrite visas 18 to 20 hours a day until the consul was closed September 4th, 1940. He continued to issue these visas to the heads of households. They could take their families with them day and night. And after he's at the hotel and he's still writing visas. He's on the train at the railway station and he's throwing visas into the crowd of desperate refugees, even as the train pulled out. He and his wife had blank sheets of paper. She would stamp it with a consulate seal and he would write his signature. They could later be written over into visas, and actually many of them worked. So after the war ends, Japan loses, he's out of a job. He ends up working menial jobs until a miracle happened in 1968. Joshua Nishri was an economic attaché to the Israeli embassy in Tokyo, and he was one of the beneficiaries of the Sugihara exit visas. He had searched for his benefactor, finally located Sugihara, contacted him. And Sugihara in 1969 was invited to visit Israel, where he was warmly greeted by the government. The many beneficiaries in Israel began to lobby for his recognition in Yad Vashem. In 1984, he was recognized as righteous among the nations. Too ill to travel to Israel, so his wife and his youngest son, Nabuki, accepted the honor. He died the following year. Again, the only Japanese to be so honored. This is one of the reasons that I update my programs constantly. Last year, 2020, well, it was declared in 2019, but 2020 by the Lithuanian government, they declared it the year of Chun Sugihara. It is estimated that as many as 100,000 are alive today descendants of the Sugihara visas. So the refugees come to Shanghai and they see look at the bund. They think, oh my God, I'm back in Vienna. And then they end up in affordable, shabby Hankou. They were helped by the Baghdadis. They were helped by the Russian Jewish community, as well as an organization called the Joint Distribution Committee, which I will refer to in shorthand as the Joint. About half of the refugees stayed in Hankou. Some of the more fortunate were able to go to the French concession. Housing was a big, big issue. Always a very big issue. A crowded, a big issue. Couldn't find work. It was squalid. Families imagine coming from a upper middle class home in Munich or Berlin or Vienna, and you're coming to the squalor that they found in one room in Shanghai. The Jewish community on the whole stayed within their own bubble and didn't really interact much with the international community. They created what was called Little Vienna. Hankou was mostly populated by the Japanese, who had settled there, as I said before, starting around 1915. And they had, on the whole, a positive attitude towards the Jews. They remembered Jacob Schiff, never forgot Jacob Schiff, and their dealings with the Baghdadi Jews, the Sephardic Jews, and the Ashkenazi Russian Jews, on the whole, were positive. And Japan, East Asia, is not intrinsically anti-Semitic. There's no blood libel. They like the fact that Jews were industrious, cooperative, productive, and potential political allies. And they thought the Jews could help them. Now, these Jewish refugees were not your poor shtetl Jews. They were primarily educated Germans, Austrians, and scholarly Eastern Europeans. And if there's somebody's raising their hand. I'm stopping for a second. It looks like I have a lot of people making comments. Oh, okay. Let me go back. I will answer all, but there's a lot of books. There's tons of books. I will answer questions at the end, but there are a lot of books, and I'll give you my email address, and I can send you an entire list of reference material. Okay, so getting back to the attitude, if there's anything that Japanese and Chinese culture admire, it's dedication to learning. And there was great admiration for the people of the book, along with concern among the Japanese about the perceived power. So many of them settled in what was called Jewtown, Hankou. Originally, that's where the Russian Jews came, but most of the Russian Jews left and ended up going to the French concession. Under Japanese control, lots of military, and also about 100,000 Chinese refugees who had fled there during the period of 1935 to 1937. The photo on the bottom was misrepresented in yet another PBS show. Sorry, PBS, I've written you a lot. And they said that the Japanese sent trucks to pick up the Jewish refugees and bring them to concentration camps. Basically, they were brought to Hankou for processing. They came with no homes, language issues. They came from first-class luxury. Remember how we used to travel in the 50s on airplanes? These people, when they traveled, they were wearing suits and dresses and furs, and they come all decked out and given tin plates to get meager meals, from luxury to squalor. Initially settled into dormitories with communal kitchens, no bed of roses. And there were some issues with this huge influx of refugees. It became overwhelming. But the Japanese and the Jewish community worked together to avoid chaos. The Jewish community started registering the refugees, arranging for internal passports, birth certificates, death certificates. The Japanese very briefly tried to control the influx by demanding financial solvency. That lasted very briefly. And you had a lot of organizations, relief organizations, black market, and even a few Japanese officials who were sympathetic, and they were helped until the port was closed in 1941. If you look on the right-hand side, I guess it's my right. Yes, you're right. And you see the beds. That was a communal area where about 3,000 refugees ended up spending the entire part of the war. And most of the people that I've spoken to in the interviews that I've done over the years, and people that I met that were survivors of Shanghai, talk about the lack of privacy, the crowdedness and the lack of privacy. They received charity from within and from without. The newcomers were not seen as competition, but rather as an asset. They didn't speak English, they didn't speak Chinese, and there was already cheap Chinese labor there. Victor Sassoon studied Maimonides, and he funded the refugees with money to start their own businesses. You see here, the Jewish women, they are sewing bedding. People needed linen. They sewing bedding using sewing machines that Sassoon supplied and cotton bales from India. These women who had to be retrained because back in Germany and in Austria in particular, many of them had housekeepers and maids. The American Joint Distribution Committee sent money and aid until 41 when it stopped. We'll get to that in a minute. And the aid did sustain many refugees. And about 70 to 75% of the refugees actually found ways to live. Challenged, but they somehow survived. Now, I've been to Shanghai in July, and I've got to tell you, I found it worse than being in Miami. And there's no heating in the winter, and it does get cold. Heard crowds over and over again. Water was undrinkable, partially because their systems could not deal with it. Sanitary conditions, well, chamber pots, not toilets, and not even French toilets. It was chamber pots that they would bring out every day, and the Chinese would empty it into wagons, and the kitchen facilities were shared and primitive. But thanks to the Refugee Processing Center, they were able to find places to live. Some of them were able to find places to live, actually about half of them in Hankou. Many of them were able to move out and go to other parts of the international settlement and the French concession. The other thing, if you look at the upper left-hand side of your screen, you are free to practice your religion if you so choose to. Religion was able to be practiced. And here is a Seder in the refugee center of Shanghai. Pearl Harbor changed things, not just for the world, but for Shanghai. And Shanghai was closed. But somehow the Jews got by, except for those with British passports. And psychologically, the refugees didn't see Shanghai as a final destination. It was a temporary stop to get to America or Canada. Sorry. They never thought they'd be there for a long time. And no matter how bad it got, they always had it better than the Chinese. The Jewish refugees were not treated as the enemies, not beaten and tortured like the Chinese. And the Jewish refugees tried to live together as best as they could. Most of them were secular, but they worked hard to accommodate the religious Polish and Lithuanian Jews. Somehow even being able to provide kosher food. School continued, a lot of sports, soccer teams, boxing leagues, and the scouting established by the Baghdadis and the Russians working together was very popular. Now, one of the survivors featured in the film The Shanghai Ghetto, 88-year-old Dr. Sigmund Tobias, who was both a yeshiva student and a boxing champion. I actually invited him to speak at my very first program in New York, attended by the Chinese press, but he was on vacation in Fort Lauderdale and couldn't come. Now, I do know somebody who lives close by, who I talked to, whose father was an American diplomat. He was put into a detainee camp. It's a prisoner of war camp. Much, much different than the way that the Jews in the Shanghai ghetto were able to live their lives and practice their religion. Here's one of our heroes, Laura Margolis of the Joint Distribution Committee, and also showing her ally, Kuroshiga Inuzuka. Interesting guy. So December 7th, 1941, Americans couldn't send money to Japan. They couldn't send money because Japan, to Shanghai, because Japan is in charge. And this woman convinced a Japanese official, Kuroshiga Inuzuka, who she knew socially from the various clubs that were there. And she convinced him to let her raise funds in exchange for IOUs to be repaid at the end of the war. And he said, wait a minute, we're going to win the war. How are you going to repay us the money? And she said, I promise you, you will be repaid the money. Anybody that we lend money to will be repaid. And at the end of the war, the Joint repaid the money. He also asked her to run a soup kitchen and ended up feeding 8,000 people a day. When she was interned as an enemy alien from February to September 1943, finally released as part of a prisoner exchange, the soup kitchen remained open. And that was thanks to Inuzuka, who wasn't anti-Semitic. You have to understand that Asian attitudes are very different than Western attitudes, particularly when it comes to wealth. Inuzuka and some of his buddies in Japan recommended that Japan set up an autonomous Jewish region, either in Manchuria or near Shanghai. Imagine Israel in Asia. This group of Japanese military and diplomats were positively influenced by the protocols of the elders of Zion. They figured, okay, we're going to set up a place for the Jewish refugees to settle. Hitler doesn't want them. We'll take them and we'll give them political and economic autonomy to live as they desire, and they will help us conquer the Pacific. He compared the Jews to fugu. That's what is known as the fugu plan. Now, fugu is a poisonous fish delicacy. If you cut out the poison, it's a delicious fish to eat. So these Japanese were cautious because of the perceived economic power of the Jews, but they felt that the Jews could help. He and other Japanese officials were instrumental in continuing to allow refugees into Shanghai until Pearl Harbor. The other thing is they thought that Rosenfeld was a Jew, and they felt that Jews could convince Roosevelt to become an ally, not of Britain, but of Japan. The Fugu Plan. Look it up. This guy's not so good. So after Pearl Harbor and the final solution being created by the Nazis, Germany assumed that Japan would implement their anti-Semitic policies. And in July of 1942, they sent Joseph Meisinger, who was the chief representative of the Gestapo in Japan. They sent him to Shanghai with his goose-stepping guys who had marched along the Bund to present a plan to Japanese authorities for the final solution in Shanghai. They would arrest the Jews in Shanghai in a surprise attack on Rosh Hashanah. I guess they assumed everybody went to shul, and then deal with the final solution. Set up a concentration camp on an island nearby, Charming Island. And there are later reports by American diplomats that they found never used gas chamber in Shanghai. Put the Jews in old ships and set them adrift on the East China Sea to die of hunger and thirst. Force the Jews to toil themselves to death in abandoned salt mines. And the Japanese categorically refused to follow the Meisinger plan for the final solution. Why? Well, first, it was a pushback on the Germans. The Japanese controlled Shanghai, not Germany. But more than that, there was a cultural issue. The Japanese had no inherent history of anti-Semitism. They did not subscribe to the concept of Aryan superiority. East Asia on the whole just doesn't have the religious, racial, and cultural prejudices against Jews. In fact, the Japanese and the Chinese both admire the culture, the fortitude, and the perceived wealth of the Jews. Again, the pro-Jewish Japanese officials admire the Jews for being powerful, but they felt they needed surveillance due to their power. The Japanese also didn't want to antagonize the Soviet Union because they had 5,000 Russian Jews living in Shanghai, plus Jews and Russian Jews in Harbin. This was something that I didn't find out until last year. Couldn't figure out what was going on. Turns out that there was a neutrality act between the Soviet Union and the Empire of Japan. War was not declared until July, the end of July, 1945, right before Hiroshima. There was also some influence by other Jews in Harbin and Japan, and a few who had settled in Kobe. And life went on. And if you chose, you could also worship freely. The Shanghai Jews came together no matter where they came from, and the disparities between Baghdadi and Russian and Manu refugees, they were put on the side. Besides the Joint Distribution Committee, you also had the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society still working, the World Jewish Congress, and you had support from the Russian Jewish community. Chusan Road was the heart of what was called Little Vienna. And even though they had language barriers and poverty and disease and isolation and crowded facilities, the refugees transitioned from being supported by welfare agencies to a functioning community, and cultural life flourished with schools, newspapers, theater, sports, and cabaret. You could go dancing. These are some examples of the rich cultural life. And the Japanese were actually very impressed by these refugees surviving squalor and poverty with German and Yiddish theater, newspapers, cabaret, and thanks to the Russians, there was a radio station. So a quick story associated with the Japanese not acquiescing to pressure to implement the final solution. The Japanese military governor of Shanghai sends for the Jewish community leaders, including, of course, the rabbis. And the Japanese governor is curious, and he said, so why, tell me, why do the Germans hate you so much? And Rebbe Kalish answered very quickly, they hate us because we're short and have dark hair. And in 1943, the Japanese acquiesced to German pressure and established what we know as the Shanghai Ghetto, which they never said it was for Jews. They always said stateless refugees. A lot of the objective was to keep them under surveillance. And it was only those who came in 1937 and after. Did not include any of the Russian Jews, did not include the few Baghdadi Jews who did not have British passports. And the Jews had to basically sell their homes outside of Hankou and sell them to the Japanese who were living in Hankou at low prices. And yes, it is seen as they were acquiescing, but the bottom line is they wanted better housing for their own people. That was one of the underlying reasons why they ended up doing it. There was some Japanese flexibility. The Orthodox Polish Jews, rabbis, and yeshiva students, they were able to extend their deadline and did not move for 1 year, did not move out of the French concession into Hankou for 1 year. The Russian Jews really helped the most. They really helped the most. But this was a different ghetto. This was a ghetto with no walls and coexistence with the Chinese. This was not Warsaw. This was not Prague. There was no exclusivity of Jews. You had 100,000 Chinese refugees living there and being very, very badly treated. Although malnourished, although facing disease, no one faced enforced starvation or annihilation. The Chinese residents helped. They vacated their own rooms to put up for many of the refugees. And before the Jewish refugees established a hospital, the Chinese hospital treated a number of Jewish refugees. In the hardest days of Hankou, 1943 to 45, the refugees and their Chinese neighbors enjoyed mutual help. Separated by language and culture, they were bound together by mutual suffering. And many friendships formed, particularly among the women. So this is a trailer from a wonderful 95-minute video. Easy to remember. It's called The Shanghai Ghetto, and it's free on YouTube. Again, the first speaker, my old friend, Dr. Sigmund Tobias, the boxing champion and the yeshiva student. He studied at the Mir Yeshiva, but he left his rabbinic studies behind when he immigrated to America in 1948, and he became a very well-known educator here. Dr. Tobias actually returned to Shanghai in 1988 as the visiting professor at the Shanghai Institute of Education. And he now, at the age of 88, lives in Sarasota, Florida.
I came home from school and the Nazi party was marching, and suddenly they said, out to Juden, that means hit the Jews.
You couldn't get into America, you couldn't get to England, you couldn't get to any of these places because we had no passports, we had no visas.
And soon word got around very quickly that there's a place in the Far East that accepts you without a visa, without papers of any kind. Where are you going? 8,000 miles away.
Shanghai, powerful and decadent, tremendously wealthy and miserably squalid.
Every disease, known or unknown to man, was rampant in epidemic proportions.
There was this very sweet Chinese man who came with his bamboo stick with two little baskets hanging on each side. Became a real friendship with my mother.
I noticed that she licked the last bit of butter off the plate.
And some just froze to death. And then you'd see in the streets in the morning little packages wrapped up where the children passed away.
And yet at the same time they had magazines, they had newspapers, they had theater productions. And they would push the dining room tables together and put mattresses on top, and we would crawl underneath, and that was supposed to be a shelter.
So they focused on their own life and on the misery of life in Shanghai, and lo and behold, after the war, they found out they're living paradise compared to what happened to their brother in Europe. That's what it was. It's all a relative thing.
It's a wonderful, wonderful video. So the Shanghai, the designated area for stateless refugees, the Shanghai Ghetto, was more segregated than an actual ghetto. The objective was to control the population, but not to annihilate it. Life in Hankou was oppressive before 1943, but now it was magnified by the sheer numbers. Malnutrition, disease, lack of privacy, sanitation, the food shortages, and the food quality was pretty bad. And then in 1944, American bombing started, and it made it even more difficult. The Russian Jews really took a lot of responsibility to help, and they also supplied news of the war, which again, the Japanese allowed. Okay, Goya. The ghetto for 1 year was controlled by a Japanese official who called himself the King of the Jews, Goya. Now, the Jews were allowed to work or go to school outside, but they had to get passes, and there was a curfew. They had to wear a badge to identify that they had a pass, but they were not wearing yellow armbands, and they were not wearing yellow stars. The curfew was difficult because a lot of the jobs in the hospitality industry that the Russians ran required that they stay late. Japanese didn't exterminate, but they did make life difficult. And if you ventured outside, particularly the teenage boys that I've interviewed, or men who were teenage boys then, they said there were frequent beatings if they got out of the ghetto past curfew. They also had to face beatings from the non-Jewish Russians. And some memories are very negative and really dependent on your personal experience. So Goya was a small man. Actually, my friend Bill Shertman called him petite, and he was a petty tyrant. If he didn't like the way you looked, he put you in jail. He liked to smack people. That was his big thing, smacking and slapping. But he was kind of tiny, wasn't really beating people up. If you were taller than him, he'd jump up on the table, stand on his toes. But he did like children or those who were shorter than him. And my friend Bill always said he gave me candy and he gave me a pass. He was schizoid in his behavior. He was very cruel. And some say he was mentally imbalanced. But this was no SS officer. And after 1 year, he was gone and passes were given more freely. He did give passes. Goya did give passes, but he did like giving people a hard time. However, he did allow the cultural activities, and often he and some of his subordinates attended the concerts in the ghetto. Although severely challenged, life went on, and there was solidarity. And unfortunately, among the refugees were 200 Jewish doctors, so disease remained more limited than it was among the Chinese population. And again, some of the chief factors making life somewhat bearable was the amount and variety of recreation they could enjoy. You had a lot of professionals. Remember, many of the people who left had money, and you had a lot of professional entertainers as well as amateur. You had drama groups, Yiddish theater, bands and orchestras, a light opera company that loved to perform The Merry Widow. Viennese gentlemen could sip coffee outside Austrian bakeries, somehow got enough butter in Little Vienna. There was a kosher butcher shop, a German delicatessen, over 30 periodicals and newspapers in German, Polish, Russian, and Yiddish. You could get candles for Shabbat. You could practice religion. You did not have to hide being a Jew. There's my old friend Bill Shertman. He loved this photo, proudly showing his hat from the Shanghai Jewish School, proud of the star. Matzah. There's a picture of matzah being distributed. And again, you can get Shabbat candles at Abraham's Dry Goods. And of course, if you wanted to, you could dance the tango at the Silk Hat nightclub. And sometimes at night, non-Jewish German nationals would sneak into Hankou to get German food and sit in the cafes. And this is where I usually get choked up. So the Mir Yeshiva had a new home in Hankou, a new synagogue, and old army barracks where they could study. And a new version of the Babylonian Talmud was published in Shanghai. Now think of it. Think of what was going on in Europe. Think about the burning, the destruction. And here in the middle of China, a new version of a Talmud is being published. My father used to say there are no atheists in the foxhole. And Jews from many religious backgrounds found that their ties to Jewish traditions were renewed. And they actually started going, at least on High Holy Day, going to services again. And this is an interesting footnote in Yad Vashem. The Japanese actually financed and helped build a small synagogue next to one of their military posts in Hankou. They were fearful, but they also had an admiration for the culture. So the Jews weren't isolated, and you had both the Jews there and the majority were Chinese, who always had it so much worse than them. There was an opportunity for the Jews to work at factories. The Japanese actually helped in some of this. It wanted to control the population. If you followed the rules, you could survive. You could still go to school, and you could still worship freely if you chose. And through the Russian Jews, they learned news of Europe. Not the camps yet, but they heard what was going on, and they knew no matter how bad it was so much worse than in their former homes. So this was one of my trips in 2011. Now it's called Hankou. That Jewish star was actually proudly put into the door by a resident to say, and people were proud of being Jewish because, again, Jews were not disdained, they were admired to a large degree. And then the war is ending, okay? Bombing of Shanghai. Thanks to America, starting the raids in 1944. And in Hankou, the water table was very close to the surface, kind of like Miami and Broward County as well. So you could not have bomb shelters. So when there was a raid, it was devastating. The worst raid was July 17th, 1945, a direct hit in Hankou on a Japanese radio station. We heard a survivor talking about artificial bomb shelters. 31 refugees were killed. Chinese deaths were much higher. You had people wounded. You had people left homeless, mostly Chinese. And these bombings continued daily until Hiroshima, which ended the air raids and ended the war. So that illustration was done by the late Eli Wachs. Eli Wachs was a great artist and a dress designer. He was the head designer for Bonwit Teller in New York. And we're going to hear him and his sister in the following video. I think what's interesting about this video is that the survivors differ in their experiences and recollections. And I've talked to many people, and people have different recollections and because they had different experiences. You ask siblings like my brother and myself about our childhood memories, and you may hear two different stories. And of course, they wrote a book. There's a lot of books on this subject, and we'll get to that at the end.
We all didn't have any food, and what I remembered mostly was obviously being hungry. I remembered that continuously. And also we lived in a one room. So I remember feeling secure as a child, but at the same time not having any privacy. So, and I remember the tightness, and I remember my parents being in one area and Ili being on another, and we were pretty much on top of each other.
Wasn't difficult for me at all because I always hated Vienna, because I experienced anti-Semitism before Hitler came. So I always wanted to leave. I remember I was 5 years old and said to my parents, why don't we go to America? Why are we staying here? I was radicalized at 5. So it was no problem for me leaving Vienna. And going to Shanghai was sort of, when you're young, it was an adventure. It was an adventure for our parents. They really had to leave a lot behind, everything behind, their whole lifestyle behind. We left with just 2 suitcases. We couldn't take anything with us. So it was a real culture shock, languages and everything. For my parents, they had memories of a different life. And it was different. All the generation had difficulty to adjust it. It was a language barrier. They didn't speak English, forget Chinese. But so it was difficult. They used to come in at noon, every day at noon. And it went like this. First you heard the planes, and then came the sirens. So one day they tried to hit the Japanese radio station, and they hit the Chinese market right inside the ghetto, and that was horrendous.
Yeah.
And that was one time I got a little afraid. So maybe we may not make it.
And it's interesting.
But it passed, actually.
At that time, it's interesting. I was 8, 9 years old, and they gave me a bag with a red cross on it, and bandages were in there, and I'm supposed to run out and help. And I didn't. And I thought, I saw all these people on rickshaws. Some of them had their legs hanging off, some had their limbs missing, and I really thought at the time that my job was to go find the limbs and go bandage them back together. I mean, really, that's what I thought, and that was my job. I ran around looking for pieces to, see who it belonged to. But I remember doing that. But you know.
Do you have a lot of those moments or times when you feel like you had very different experiences or very different reactions?
Right, yeah.
Well, absolutely.
That's the story of the book.
Absolutely.
As a matter of fact, when we started the book, we didn't think about it as writing with different memories. We thought we were writing one book.
Yes.
And I thought what Deborah had written about Vienna, where our parents told her they're going on a vacation. So I said to her, what do you mean vacation? And then it occurred to me, leave it like that. These are her memories, and leave it like that. So it adds another dimension to the story.
I think I learned in an early age to be afraid, and I was pretty much afraid of everything. And I've always felt that at some point in my life, I don't want to be a victim.
The experiences were always out there for me, but you internalize them. So they affect your behavior, even if you don't think they do, in a way. And had some positive aspects of it. Positive aspect was when I ran into difficulties here, starting into business, and got fired a few times from jobs. And my attitude was, if I survived Shanghai, this is nothing. This is no problem. And that helps a lot. On the other side, still today, I'm still aware if I walk on the street at night and somebody walks behind me, I'm aware of it. I will cross the street.
So the war ends 1945, the war in the Pacific ends, and the Shanghai Ghetto is liberated, September 3rd, 1945, and almost all of the Jews survived. The Jews who had fled the Holocaust, plus over 5,000 Russian Jews. The community started to dwindle, many Jews going to Israel, the United States, Australia, Hong Kong. And one of the things that stands out to me, oh, by the way, Colonel Meisinger was executed in 1947, that's yay, was that we all know what happened with General Eisenhower, capturing what happened in the camps, and the films made it to the Shanghai Ghetto. This is an eyewitness who talks about the liberation. And he says, a deep sorrow swept through the streets. Mutti's sister and the rest of her family were murdered at Dachau, and Mutti wept. Everything we'd been through suddenly paled in comparison. The hunger, disease, curfews, poverty, none of it mattered anymore. We were lucky. Nobody gassed us. We had our lives. but no cause for celebration. So Shanghai's free of the Japanese. American GIs and dollars came in, and the process of rebuilding began. Between 1945 and 1948, you had most of the Jews left. You had 1,000 who went back to Europe to look for families. 6,000 went to the US, others went to Canada, some went to South America and South Africa. 1948, the Displaced Persons Act, but that only affected those living in, who came to Shanghai after 37. Anybody who came earlier was not eligible and did not apply to any of those Russian Jews who lost all opportunity to get out. And the truce between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao is ending. The Civil War is flaring, and Mao is marching to Shanghai. The anti-communist Russian Jews joined other refugees in trying to get out. In the summer of 1948, the JDC in Shanghai reported over 5,300 refugees, and a call went out to the world to save these Jews as the communist forces are approaching the city. The US, oh, what do you think? They said no, right? And who came to the aid of these Russian Jews who needed to get out? Russian Jews and those European Jews who had come before 37. Imagine the amazement of these Jews in Shanghai who see a ship flying the Israeli flag coming up the river to rescue them. It's a pretty amazing shot. I always get choked up when I see it. A bad story. Most of you don't know this story. Most of the ships that came to Shanghai from Israel went directly to Israel. One ship came and took the refugees to San Francisco, and then they had to go across the United States to pick up another ship to go to Israel in New York. The Jewish refugees were met by armed American soldiers, escorted them to the trains, were not allowed to get off the train, were escorted by armed American soldiers to the port in New York, to the Israeli ship, and to final safety. So Jewish life ended. The refugees fled again. The synagogues were shuttered. The Jews were gone. But Jewish culture, in a way, returned to China, where Judaism is not an official religion, but stories from the Talmud are retold, Torah is being studied, and the Jewish scholars are all Chinese. Since 1992, when Israel was one of the first countries to establish relations with China, there's been a steady increase in exchange between non-Chinese studying the Shanghai Ghetto and Chinese academics who are trying to make sense of this odd little Jewish settlement. The gentleman you see here is Dr. Chu Jin, who oversees a very large, very active Judaic studies program at Nanjing University, and he's not the only one. The Chinese teach this period of history to their children. And there's even a well-loved animated movie called A Jewish Girl in Shanghai. And I'm going to play it without sound because it's in Chinese, but you have to take this with a caveat. I have mentioned several times the hatred, the justifiable hatred that the Chinese had for the Japanese. And this produced exaggeration. The Japanese did not cooperate with Nazi persecution. They did not make blankets out of Jewish hair or tapestry out of Jewish hair. There is an exaggeration, but it's done for a purpose. But the point is, at the end of it, it's very, very poignant, and you will understand that the relationship between the Jews and the Chinese continue. So it starts with an overview showing Nazis in Europe in the 30s. And there's a little girl and her brother and their mother. And they're coming to arrest the mother. And where do the children go? To Shanghai. Remember, it's a children's cartoon. So she pays him with a locket that her mother had given her. And it leads him to try and find her. So he's going to invite her to share in their food, to have dumplings. And his uncle is there. Basically, the father is killed by the Japanese. Now, this is the exaggeration. A tapestry carpet made out of Jewish women's hair. This is total exaggeration. But it does have a happy ending. And there's a reason for my showing this. She gets her mother's necklace back. The uncle's arrested, but it's okay. The war's about to end. So the war ends, and miracle of miracle, the father finds them in Shanghai. And she leaves playing her violin. And this is the point. Goodbye. Don't forget to come back. And they reunite 60 years later to let our children know the story about us. And this is the Ohel Moshe Synagogue and Jewish Refugee Museum. It's actually not just a museum, but an active synagogue for the expatriates who live in Shanghai. There were about, well, before the pandemic, there were about 3,000 Jewish expats who lived in Shanghai, primarily, by the way, French. They had weddings. I know they had bat mitzvahs there. Chabad runs it. And it was closed for a while, and I was very concerned. I thought maybe something happened because I know there was some issues with the actual China. There's a small community of Chinese Jews, and there was an issue with the government. So I thought, oh God, they're closing. It turns out that they reopened it just this past December. And it was actually closed for a renovation. It's actually 4 times larger than before. And it now has nearly 1,000 exhibits there, 1,000 exhibits telling the story of Jews in Shanghai and their relationship with the Chinese. It has narratives and books and memorabilia that were donated and new technologies to improve the visitor experience. In contrast to the problems that the Chinese Jews, not expats, but Chinese Jews have had with the Chinese government recently, the relationship between China and Israel remains strong. I've actually, in visits to my distributor up in Haifa in Israel, visited some think tanks that the Chinese had established in Israel, supported by the Chinese to develop Jewish technology. When I told my Chinese staff that I was Jewish, this is how they said, "Oh, you're Jewish?" I try to be an ethical businessman by studying the Talmud. And when I told a new acquaintance just a few years ago in Shanghai, he thanked me for Israel's assistance after a major earthquake in Sichuan province and told me how proud he was of our friendship and our joint history. And I've been told that the greatest civilization of all, of course, is the Chinese. And the second greatest civilization is the Jews. So we have a very special guest with us here tonight, Senor Pedro Liebendag, who lived in Shanghai from 1941 until 47, after his family had fled Nazi Germany. Pedro currently lives in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and we are fortunate to have him with us tonight, visiting family along with his wife. His daughter Marlene produced and directed a documentary about his story, and I'm proud to share the trailer. He also recorded his experience as a testimony for the Shoah Visual History Foundation Library, the Shoah Foundation, very important. So after this clip, this brief clip, I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to ask Pedro to share memories and answer any questions you may have.
Hello. Good afternoon. Good night.
Pedro, I'm showing the anniversary trailer first, and then we're going to stop sharing the screen. This is what your daughter did, what Marlene did.
Siempre me fascinó la historia de mi viejo. Creo que en realidad lo que me conmueve no son los hechos, sino cómo mi papá abraza la vida, cómo transforma las cosas, las puede comprender y trascender.
I'd hate to do it in German, this part. This little box, which is the original box, saved our lives. Internacional. llegaron sin nada y eran alojados en campos de refugiados, ayudados por asociaciones judías americanas.
You see, in about 1930s, the Japanese, they occupied Shanghai, the city. The Japanese government, they raised the...
Judíos tenían sus puestos cerca. Were all my friends. This guy is Peter Halevi, who lives in Israel. This and these are two brothers. They lived just across from my house. It is now 60 years ago that I lived here in the Ghetto of Shanghai.
And you have the spirit and the fortitude, never ever give up.
You always come back. Thank you, Shanghai.
And now, Peter,
Yes.
Pedro, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experiences in Shanghai and how you got there and how you got out of there?
All right. I want to start by telling you that your friend, the boxing champion, was in the same boxing place as I was. The only thing, he was big and tough, and I definitely wasn't that big and tough. But I know him, and the last time I met him was at the last get-together of Shanghai survivors in the city of Toronto. I met him there. We said hello to each other, but our lives had changed a lot. And personally, I have to tell everybody that how did I get into Argentina? At the time, Argentina was as anti-Semitic as Germany had been before. So as a Jew, it was impossible to get a visa. My father, who was in certain ways a very strong-willed guy, told the Argentine ambassador in Shanghai that either he gets into Argentina as a Jew or he won't go. Well, we went, and I ended up traveling a night with a little sailboat and some contrabandists into the Rio de la Plata, which is like a small ocean. It's a tremendous place with high tides. And I landed at 4 o'clock in the morning with my parents in a little place called Tigre in the nearby Buenos Aires. Well, from there, we finally ended up in Buenos Aires, where we had a family, and I was already a big boy. At 14, I started to work in a textile factory at night because I was afraid that during the day, they might catch me and find out that I didn't have any documentation. So I must say I learned the hard way. And when anybody asks me what I did during all the years between 14 and 19, I always tell them they ask the wrong question. They should ask me what I didn't do, because there's everything I did just to make a few bucks. But I made it. I got into the cowhide and leather business, and I spent 66 years of my life in that business. And after a few years, I became a director of a very important international, multinational company. And for many, many years, I traveled the world for 6 months a year, including the Soviet Union, Poland, you name it, and I was there. No place in the world except India where I didn't travel. And today I do a lot of business in India. So I got around a little bit, and I learned the Argentine way of doing business very quickly.
It's different.
You know, when you need to do something the incorrect or correct way, you learn fast. Otherwise, you drown. And basically, that is my story.
Well, I'm going to ask you, you have been back to Shanghai
Yes,
several
a few
times.
times.
How is it going back to Shanghai?
Oh, to me, it was coming back to the place that saved my life. I was some of the pictures you showed, I was with the people who organized the coming back of the former survivors. And I greatly appreciated all that Shanghai did for me. And I told them so. And then I went back. This was with my daughter. No, wait a minute. I went back the first time with my late wife. Amongst all the things that happened to me, I became a widower at the age of 48 because, you know, the war wasn't enough. I had to add to it. So after that, I was lucky enough to meet my present wife. And for the last 37 years, we are together and only have 7 kids and 16 grandchildren. and thank God have a very big home where we can
So
all for the high holidays. And today we have a very good life in Argentina, except for the general political situation, which is just about terrible. But I don't want to go into that because you want to listen to Shanghai and
Well,
not to Buenos Aires.
the thing I was thinking of, Pedro, is the fact that you have 16 grandchildren. And if your family had stayed in Hamburg, right? If you had not gone to Shanghai, those 16 grandchildren would not be here today.
Right.
It's the fact that Shanghai saved not just you, but
Right.
saved so many. And people don't realize it.
Yes, but you know, I have no great grandchildren, and I tell my grandchildren, this is crazy. They look at movies and look at Netflix, and what I used to do was much more fun. But they have to learn that.
So when you went to Shanghai, did you visit the Ohel Moshe? Have you gone there?
Now, let me tell you first how I got to Shanghai, or we got to Shanghai.
Yeah.
We took the Trans-Siberian train.
Okay.
Plain winter in January, and when we came to Harbin, the weather was about 40 below zero. Well, I'm talking Celsius. You translate it into your American terms. I don't know exactly how
that. It was cold. It was very cold.
Look, my father told me, please, I was wearing short pants, as every kid in Germany does, and Shanghai too, because we had no money for anything else. But when I started showing the movie in Buenos Aires, which is totally paid for, I thought I would find 10 guys who would love to put up money. But you know, we Jews have a problem. When you talk about money, suddenly you have less friends. But it's all right. I could do it, and I did it.
But you did Trans-Siberian Railroad. Did you go from there down to Harbin? And from Harbin to Shanghai?
Well, we went up to Harbin. Yes, because Harbin today is a part of China. At the time, it was Manchuria. But I must tell all of you, Harbin was a city with a lot of Jewish population, and probably today has the best kept up Jewish cemetery in the world. And when our train stopped in Harbin, it was a Friday night. And suddenly, a lot of Jews appeared at the train station and put up a few tables and said, we understand that you are immigrants from Germany, and we invite you for a Jewish meal next to the train. And it was a big thing for all of us. None of us spoke Yiddish. I learned that because on my travels, it was the most important language I could talk. And
Pedro, I hate to interrupt you, but they allowed me for 2 hours, and it looks like we're going to have to wind up our presentation. But we're so glad to have you here. So glad that you have 16 grandchildren. We hope you have many great grandchildren. And we're so grateful the fact that that Jews were able to find some place to leave Germany and Austria and Poland. I'm very grateful. My Bubby and Zadie left when they were teenagers back in like 1910, and we just have to be very grateful no matter what you went through. Looks like you've led a very, very good life. So we hope that you live long and prosper. And
okay, I always say when they ask me what happened, I said, listen, Hitler is dead and I am alive. So there's
beautiful attitude.
Finish.
That is beautiful. Helene, Pedro, thank you so much for such a fascinating program. I could listen even longer, but we've had our 2 hours, but we may have to do something like this again to hear more stories.
Go back.
Definitely.
Oh,
thank you so very much.
What I need is some of you to invite me to a Yiddish dinner, and then I will tell you.
Okay, my cook's here. Get cooking. And invite us all to dinner.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you again, Helene. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this evening. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Ladies, just one quick reminder. Our next event will be March 14th, which will be our Women's Seder. You will be getting information about it soon. So watch your email for that. Thank you again, everybody. Good night.
I just want to add one thing.
Yes, Pedro.
Your information on Shanghai is absolutely excellent.
Thank you.
Very accurate, because I was there.